Egypt has been in a building economic and political crisis for years now, and yet the solution from the government has been a brand new capital city in the middle of the desert. In an expansive desert that is 30 miles east of Cairo, Egypt's new unnamed city is rising out of seemingly nothing but sand and debt. I mean, when I say debt, I mean we're talking mountains of debt. Already boasting the tallest tower in Africa as well as the biggest cathedral in the Middle East, this city is one of a series of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's grand mega projects that is intended to develop the country's economy and build a monument of glory in his and the state's name. Something that, especially in recent years, has come into serious question. Construction of this new administrative capital began back in 2016, and it is something that is supposed to be completed in phases. Phases that are continuously seemingly delayed and also severely over budget. According to Khaled Abbas, who is the chairman of the Administrative Capital for Urban Development, or ACUD, which is the company overseeing the project, Phase 1 is almost complete, and Phase 2 is expected to begin in the last quarter of this next year. At the point in time that I'm making this video, more than 1,500 families have moved into the new capital, at least according to Abbas. And by the end of 2024, he expects this number to have risen to around 10,000 families. But honestly, when we were looking at this entire thing, that number is tiny in comparison to the vast emptiness of the veritable ghost towns around them, which is a problem considering that quite literally billions of dollars have already been poured into this project, which, as I said before, is severely over budget, with very little to show for that money. As all of this is happening, in the backdrop of all of this, the Egyptian pound has lost more than 75% of its value in the last 2 years alone. Combine this with weak institutions, an overbearing state, and a military that just sucks up whatever little money is left remaining in the government, and you have a recipe that has deterred investment and competition, and something that has led to the decay of the state itself. A borrowing spree under President Sisi has left Egypt with heavy foreign debt. Foreign creditors have been shying away, pushing the Cairo government to borrow domestically even as interest rates surge, which in turn spawn even bigger deficits. As Egypt has been getting pushed further and further and further into crisis, it brings up an important question then. How did we get here? What has happened? And what exactly is going to happen next? To that end, we're going to need to dive into the recent history of something that surely could not be contentious or unstable at all, the Middle East, and also the Arab Spring from that. Please, YouTube gods, be kind on my soul. First up, some context. Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the episode, I just want to thank each and every person that went on my trip to Italy here with me and my wife, because I had a ton of fun with you all. Whether it was going to the Roman Colosseum, whether it was exploring the forums, whether it was going to all these different things, it was an absolute blast, and I cannot wait to see more of you in future trips. One of the things that I love, perhaps more than anything else about this job, is specifically that I get to go to places and meet with people all over the world. That's something that I've always enjoyed. And for anyone who's watching this right now, it would make my world if you would join me at the German Christmas markets that I will be leading a trip to here come this November. We are going to see the Christmas markets in Munich, in Salzburg, and Vienna. We are also going to see castles. We're going to see all kinds of different sites. And even beyond that, just the base trip, we're also going to be going and doing a little bit of exploring around and seeing other things with some people while we're there. Honestly, when you go on one of these trips, it's really nice because you don't typically have to worry about planning anything. From having a guide who speaks the local language to be able to take you around, from your hotel accommodations being taken care of while you're there, and in general, the fun of going to places in a group, it's not something that I can really describe. It's just something that you have to experience for yourself. There's only a limited amount of spots, so if you want to join me on this trip to Germany, you only have to put 25% down if you book it now. And beyond that, there are payment plans moving forward in order to make things easier for people. Obviously, at different points, I'm going to do more random meetups with people, but if you want to go on a dedicated trip with me, this is your chance. Thank you, everyone. Now back to the show. If any of you out there who are watching this video right now have any Egyptian banknotes and you pick them up and look at them on both sides, you're going to see two competing strands of the country's heritage. The design on one side evokes Islam while the other evokes the pharaohs, but both of these have a central place in the nation's history. That is really the complexity of Egypt. It has been over 2,000 years since the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaoh dynasty of Egypt, and it's been 1,400 years since the arrival of Islam. And still, to this day, Egyptians argue about their respective contributions to national identity and how exactly all of that plays out. For anyone who is wondering why it is that I am talking about from the beginning, we are talking about a country whose national identity is easily one of the oldest and most prestigious in all of human history. This is Egypt, which in turn creates a lot of baggage for both modern political and social thought. Normally, when I make any geopolitical history video, what I usually have to do is go back into the history of the country, but there's a limit on what it is that I can do with Egypt, because there's no way in hell I can go over 2,000 odd years of history. Actually, I say that off the top of my head. It's not even 2,000 years, it's more like 3,000 to 4,000 years as it is. And that is simply too much. So if we're going to be talking about the modern Egyptian state and its problems and where it is that began, that is actually something that is going to start back with Napoleon. Yes, Napoleon, the French leader and emperor, that guy. Back in the year 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte would lead a French invasion of Egypt, something that would prove to be one of the most important events in Egypt's modern history. The French occupation of Egypt was ultimately unsuccessful, and it did not last very long, as by 1801, the French were forced to withdraw. But the events that invasion set in motion were things that were going to drastically change Egypt's future. You see, my friends, the ease at which the French defeated the Mamelukes would shake popular confidence in their ability to rule. It doesn't really help that the Mamelukes had also attempted a revolt against Ottoman control in the decades prior, which, technically speaking, they were vassals of the Ottoman state, this being, again, decades before the French had ever arrived. The result of that was that when the French finally left, the Ottoman Sultan would go and send a new army down under the command of Muhammad Ali to re-establish Ottoman authority in Egypt. After several years of struggle, Muhammad Ali was finally able to gain favor with the people and establish himself as being the person in control. He would cement his control of the Egyptian state by massacring the Mamelukes in a surprise attack at their citadel in 1805, and after this, he was recognized as being the governor of Egypt by the Sultan. Once this was done, Muhammad Ali would set out to establish Egypt as an independent kingdom under his control, with a massive modernization effort that would revolutionize Egypt's economic and military power. This is a weird point in Egypt's history, because technically speaking, for the next couple hundred years, Egypt is, again, technically a vassal under the Ottoman state, but also, for all intents and purposes, it's independent. Under Muhammad Ali's rule, Egypt's agricultural lands were expanded and also nationalized, becoming state tax farms to generate revenue for reforms. Ali would use this income to establish an industrial base, which in turn would produce equipment that would be needed for a modern army and navy, as well as textiles. At the same time that he would do this, he would also make sure that those institutions would have bodies, as he would institute a draft for the military and labor in state factories. In order to make sure that his state would succeed, he would also send expeditions to Europe in order to learn languages, bring back new technologies, and also organizational strategies. The educational system was then expanded in order to produce bureaucrats and managers that would be needed to fill positions in this new economy and government. The result of this was revolutionary in Egypt, quickly growing the economy and dramatically increasing social mobility in a society that really, up until this point, had largely been feudal. With promising results, Ali was then able to use his new economic and military power to expand his territory, at one point even going and threatening Constantinople with invasion. Eventually, Egypt would go on to grow to include Sudan, parts of Libya, the Levant, and Hijaz at its greatest extent. Most importantly, though, he would establish a hereditary succession that would rule Egypt, at least technically, in name, until 1952. The biggest problem, though, that he would end up facing, and pretty much is the problem with any great empire, as you've probably seen on this channel, is that Ali's successors were not nearly as capable or revolutionary as he was. As an example of that, his grandson, Ismail Pasha, would oversee the construction of the Suez Canal, and also the modernization of Cairo and other Egyptian cities. Ultimately, though, his very expensive tastes and expenditures would end up bankrupting the country and would lead to an invasion by the British in 1882, which in turn would result in Egypt losing its independence under a colonial administration. That being said, Muhammad Ali's dynasty would stay on in power under the control of a British administration. This dynasty would not actually be displaced until the Free Officers' Revolution in 1952, which would finally end the colonial administration and lead to the establishment of the Arab Republic of Egypt. And this, my friends, is where the modern state of Egypt that we know today comes from. And I'm not going to go through all of this, as that would take, again, way too much time, but there are a few key points going into its history that I have to talk about because it's going to be affecting everything that we're talking about. Okay, in rapid order, President Gamal Abdel Nasser becomes the first elected leader of the Republic in 1956, as well as being the first Egyptian to actually lead the government of Egypt since before the invasion of Alexander the Great over 2,000 years before. For anyone who's confused about this and wondering like, okay, wait, but hold on, the Mamelukes controlled things prior to, were they not Egyptian? No, they weren't. The Mamelukes were actually a slave soldier class that were imported into Egypt from varying different states around them in order to actually, serve as their military. They have a whole fascinating history that I would love to go into at some point here on my podcast. So yeah, first time in 2,000 years, native Egyptian ruler. The era under Nasser would witness a rapid increase in living standards that was unparalleled in Egypt's millennia of history. And this time is regarded as a point in which the ordinary Egyptian citizens would enjoy unprecedented access to housing, education, employment, healthcare, and nourishment, as well as other forms of social welfare. It was effectively a golden age for the population. I say that, of course, but at the same time, this was coupled with severe controversy. Nasser would rule as an autocrat. He was someone who you did not question, or else there was a possibility that you were going to disappear. That didn't really matter for nearly as much of the population, though, because he was extremely popular within Egypt and also throughout the Arab world over the course of his rule. His willingness to stand up to Western powers and to Israel, as well as the Suez Crisis, won him support throughout the region. However, at the same time, his aggressive foreign policy would simultaneously lead to a war with Israel, which would be the Six-Day War in 1967. That conflict would see the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian armies routed by the Israelis and was a great loss of prestige. Israel afterwards would occupy the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. This defeat was a severe blow to Nasser's prestige, both at home and also abroad. And in many cases, with an autocratic ruler, this is usually where you would see a revolt from within their own party or grouping, or where they would ultimately have to step down. Following this defeat, Nasser would make a very dramatic offer to resign, but that ended up actually being retracted in the face of mass demonstrations from the people who wanted him to stay because he was just that popular. Still though, in the end, Nasser would die, and after his death, another of the original revolutionary free officers, Vice President Anwar el-Sadat, he was elected as president of Egypt. Now what's funny about all this is that Nasser supporters and government had settled on Sadat as a transitional figure that they believed at the time could be easily manipulated, until they got someone better who they actually wanted in charge. That being said, however, Sadat ended up actually having a decently long term in office, and also had a bunch of plans for what he wanted to do to change Egypt. Through these plans and also some astute political moves, he was able to institute a corrective revolution, something in which the government, the military, other security forces, all would be purged of the people who had previously supported his predecessor, and the reason being is because he wanted to tone down the revolution a little bit. Also, Sadat actually encouraged the emergence of an Islamist movement, something which had actually been suppressed by Nasser. Believing that Islamists were more socially conservative, which does make sense, he gave them considerable cultural and ideological autonomy in exchange for political support. So different Islamist factions within Egypt were able to pretty much do whatever it is that they wanted, which I have to say this would ultimately end up backfiring on him to a degree when a fundamentalist officer would end up assassinating him in 1981. So yeah, that did actually happen. Either way, that would then lead to Hosni Mubarak, vice president since 1975 and an Air Force commander back during the October 1973 war with Israel. He was elected as president later that month. He was subsequently confirmed by popular referendum for 3 more 6-year terms, most recently this being in September of 2005. The results of those referendums are, however, of questionable status and validity, considering that, with the exception of the one that was conducted back in September of 2005, Mubarak was the only candidate in all of those previous ones. So yeah, political freedom was never exactly really synonymous with the whole Egyptian state. And if you're wondering what it is that I mean and why this is very important, a state of emergency remained in force throughout the entirety of Mubarak's presidency, and this would provide a basis for arbitrary detention and unfair trials. The president could do pretty much whatever it is that he wanted, and he did this. On one hand, being in a state of emergency would allow the Egyptian state to combat terrorism, which was a constant threat within its borders, with Islamists attacking government institutions as well as foreign tourists, one of the key things that was needed to bring in foreign dollars. On the other other hand, it also meant that anyone who even remotely displeased a government official could find themselves in jail without ever actually committing a crime. And this happened a lot. In 2007, it was reported by Amnesty International that the Egyptian police would routinely engage in beatings, electric shocks, prolonged suspension by the wrists and ankles in contorted positions, death threats, and varying forms of abuse amongst the Egyptian populace. It was estimated in 2009 that anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Egyptians were being held without charge, and that police and security forces were regularly using torture and brutality in order to intimidate both prisoners and just the public at large. According to another series of documents coming from the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights, there were 701 cases of torture at Egyptian police stations from 1985 to 2011, and 204 victims would die of torture and mistreatment during this time. Some of these cases were even reported as happening in broad daylight, things that were in full view of the public, but there was nothing that they could really do about it. At the same time that physical punishment and torture were rampant across the country, freedom of speech, association, and assembly were severely limited under Mubarak. As an example of this, the press law, the publications law, and the penal code regulated the press, and it would call for punishment by fines or imprisonment for those who criticized the president. Amazingly enough, despite such threats of imprisonment or even worse, over the course of the 2000s, the number of bloggers that were calling out government abuse would actually grow as access to the internet would become more and more common. Now, my friends, when you are going and watching this video, you understand that government abuse is never a good thing. But typically speaking, historically, there is a degree to which people will tolerate it so long as there is either a greater perceived threat or if they are economically doing well. Egypt, however, would come to test these limits. Over the course of the 1990s, Mubarak would undertake an ambitious series of domestic economic reform programs to reduce the size of the public sector that had ballooned in previous, more socialist governments. With some reforms, a series of International Monetary Fund arrangements, and coupled with massive external debt relief resulting from Egypt's participation in the Gulf War coalition, Egypt was during this time able to improve its economy, at least on the greater physical scale. Inflation would lower from 1981 to 2006, GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity would increase 4 times from what it was in 1981 versus what it would be in 2006, and on paper, looking at this, the average Egyptian was doing pretty well. But, as what we would come to find out, and what persists to this day, this, to a degree, was smoke and mirrors. A lot of it wasn't real. You see, my friends, economic growth was very far from evenly spread, as wealth was largely concentrated in corrupt elite officials and those that were associated with the ruling government. The propping up of and then the flotation of the Egyptian pound, combined with liberalization of the country's money markets, as well as strategic reduction in government social spending, this all resulted in terrible hardships for the majority of the Egyptian people. And I'm going to need to go ahead and explain these terms here because this is where it all gets messy, and it leads to the modern day. First off, okay, floating the Egyptian pound, what does that mean? To be perfectly blunt, the crisis that Egypt is facing now, it is not the first time that they have actually faced it. Egypt's foreign exchange reserves would fall from $36 billion in December of 2010 to only $16.3 billion in January of 2012. This being as a result of the Egyptian state propping up the Egyptian pound against the dollar. Essentially, what would happen is that since the majority of goods in Egypt had to, and still to this day, be imported, having a stronger and more valuable currency is something that makes it easier for the average Egyptian to go and purchase those much needed goods. So for decades, what the government of Egypt would do is prop up the value of its own currency by buying it at above market prices whenever possible. Now, I know a number of people watching this may be confused as to what that actually does, and the answer is a few things, both positive and negative. On one hand, it makes it easier to purchase goods, as I have already said, but at the same time, that also makes Egyptian goods less competitive on the market because the value of their currency has been artificially inflated. This is something that would weaken their exports and production at home, meaning a less productive society. At the same time, with less goods being sold, that means less foreign currency that is coming into the country, which in turn can be used to purchase more goods. When you go and combine that with the cost of propping up their own currency, and you have a recipe that is going to suck away all foreign currency that is actually needed to buy things faster than it can actually be replaced. which, as you can imagine, has some consequences. As the economy of Egypt would continue to worsen, concerns about social unrest and the country's ability to meet its financial targets all led to credit rating agencies lowering the country's credit rating on several occasions. With time, housing became more and more expensive, as well as scarce, for a population that was densely smushed into slums by the Nile River. As the population of Egypt grew, it became common to have a family of 6 or 7 people living together in a single room, something the likes of which would have been seen in early depictions of the Industrial Revolution. In many Egyptian households, one of the things that became very common was for family members to take turns sleeping on the same bed, as overcrowding made it essentially impossible to have more space for beds to actually fit everyone at the same time. Meanwhile, wealthy elites and people who are associated with the government are seen driving down these dirty, crowded, narrow streets in luxury sports cars. It is into this kind of picture that the Arab Spring hits Egypt, and everything that I have listed that was kind of bad gets significantly worse. Now, my friends, as I've already said a couple times in here, I'm not going to be going into the full story of the Arab Spring, as that in and of itself would be an insane undertaking spanning multiple countries that I do not have the time to do that for this video. If you want a full video on the Arab Spring, let me know in the comment section below, but either way, we're going to go ahead and summarize things for what is relevant here. The Arab Spring, as we call it, refers to a period of protests beginning on December 18th, 2010 in Tunisia, something which would quickly spread to numerous other Arab nations and would result in regime change in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. For those that did not experience this change, it would result in greater repression and/or violence in states such as Syria, Bahrain, Sudan, and other places. In the case of Egypt, though, protests and strikes would begin on January 25th, 2011, this being National Police Day, and would last for 18 days, bringing together varying different opposition groups and peoples representing a wide cross-section of the entirety of Egyptian society. As for why this would happen, well, it is somewhat similar to Tunisia. While it was the death of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia that would spark the Arab Spring there, in Egypt it was another death that would prove an important symbolic catalyst for the revolution. In the year 2010, there was a young man by the name of Khalid Said who was beaten to death by 2 police officers after being dragged out of a cyber cafe in Alexandria. The photographs of this event and his body were circulated online, and it was something that was truly gruesome and horrible. After this event, in protest, a Facebook group called We Are All Khalid Said would quickly draw in new members in the number of hundreds of thousands. People were very angry, and what seemed to have a particular impact in this case was the fact that Said was not a political dissident. He wasn't an Islamic radical. He wasn't any kind of person that was engaged in politics. He was just an average, everyday young Egyptian who was victimized by the police. This is something that effectively every kind of person could relate to. In a country that is as religious as Egypt, he was turned into a form of martyr, something that in Egypt itself historically has very deep roots with both Islam and also Christianity. The Facebook page and other social media sites very quickly became public forums, both for the remembrance of Said and also for the discourse around what he had died because of and for. These issues became fundamental to the outbreak of protest in the coming year. As for what that reason is, police had actually gone and claimed that Said died by suffocation after attempting to swallow a bag of hashish, which is illegal there in Egypt. However, during the trial, it became very apparent that Said had not done this. Instead, he was being targeted by police for posting a video online that accused the police itself of actually colluding with drug dealers. As news began to circulate more and more and more online, more and more people became aware of it within Egypt, and small-scale local demonstrations began to take place protesting Said's death. But it was this particular Facebook group that I am talking about that would put out an announcement that on January 25th, protests were supposed to be held that would change everything, because January 25th was National Police Day, and that was going to be the greatest irony of all of this. And this, my friends, is when the Arab Spring protests fully break out in Egypt. As crowds would gather across the country, chanting could be heard saying, "The people want to bring down the regime." Protesters across the state sought to bring about political change in the wake of decades of corruption, police brutality, unemployment, media censorship, inflation, and many other problems that had been plaguing society. The way that these protests would break out would take varying different forms. Sometimes it would include occupation of specific locations, such as downtown Cairo's Tahrir Square, to more simple and common things like labor strikes and simple acts of civil disobedience. Some would even get violent, with clashes with the armed forces and other clashes with police. This kind of violence that I am talking about here over the course of these protests would result in 846 deaths, as well as several thousand injuries. The result of these protests, though, it would actually end up being a success. President Hosni Mubarak, who had been in office since 1981, was then deposed on February 11th, 2011, nearly 30 years. After which, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, would dissolve the Egyptian parliament, suspend the constitution, and dissolve the nation's emergency laws, things that had been in place, again, since Mubarak had taken charge. Even with his resignation, Mubarak was not going to be spared, though. The amount of protesters that had died over the course of this time period would result in him being captured and sentenced to life in prison in June of 2012. I say this, but in the end, afterwards, he was actually released after less than a year. And so it was then, my friends, that in the wake of the Arab Spring, that Islamist groups that had previously been suppressed were now able to legally form political parties for the first time in Egyptian history. A variety of different political parties would emerge during this time period that would represent a broad spectrum of political thought, from more moderate and business-friendly forces like the Muslim Brotherhood, which had decades of experience on the margins of Egyptian politics, to more hardline Salafi parties that really had no political experience. Perhaps because of their long-time oppression, these parties were particularly zealous in their campaigning, and they were remarkably successful in the polls. The Muslim Brotherhood Freedom and Justice Party candidate, Mohamed Morsi, would end up being the person who would become president on June 30th, 2012. I say this though, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, revolutions are never exactly clean, and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood was pretty short-lived. The judiciary would ultimately void the parliamentary vote and would dissolve the legislature in 2012. Then, in 2013, after months of tension, Egypt's political crisis would implode when the army, led by an individual by the name of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the same guy that we mentioned previously in this video, a former field marshal and the chief of staff, went and ousted President Mohamed Morsi, who was the only civilian president democratically elected in the Arab region's most populous country. The fact that the military had moved in to overthrow a democratically elected leader, this is something that would only deepen the political schism within society. Yes, this is a very complicated thing that would occur at this time, because millions of Egyptians had protested specifically against Morsi. They didn't want him in charge. But also, there were also millions of people who did want him, who protested the forced departure of Morsi. Eventually, a crackdown by security forces would be the thing that would have to stop the tides of protests, and this would kill hundreds of people. Egypt was declared to be in a new state of emergency. This is the environment that brings us to the modern day that we are talking about now. This is the moment in which Sisi takes charge, and everything gets very hazy with the state's relationship with the military. Because you see, my friends, the military would steadily over this time period cement its political dominance. The Constitution was amended to enshrine the military's prominent role in politics, and also prohibit political parties that were founded based on religion, i.e. the Muslim Brotherhood, no longer a thing. In order to stop further protests, and also potentially hinder any political movements from arising out of religious institutions, the government would go on to issue a new law that would ban unauthorized gatherings of more than 10 people. With this out of the way, the judiciary would go and charge the previous president, Morsi, with espionage as well as unspecified aggressive acts. After this trial, he was then subsequently sentenced to death. Weirdly enough, depending upon how you want to take this, Morsi ended up getting out of that death sentence, but not entirely. His trial ended up being overturned in 2016, and so they had to do a retrial, but over the course of that retrial in 2019, he would end up dying. So nothing ended up ever actually being resolved. There are still accusations to this day that he was denied appropriate medical care during this time, as the state would much rather have him just disappear than survive the trial itself. As for the political entity that he'd been a part of, the government would go and designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and that was the end of that. Moving on from this, or rather going back in time, in 2014, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi would go and win a new new presidential election, something that would result in great changes across society as large sections of it were marginalized. The internal issues then faced by Egypt were only further complicated with time, as militants in the Sinai Peninsula would go and pledge their allegiance to the Islamic State in 2014, which had become significantly more active during this time period. In 2015, ISIS would go and stage a wave of attacks in the Sinai Peninsula against the military, Coptic Christians, and the Sufi communities. In response to this, the Egyptian army would go and launch a major offensive against ISIS, but it didn't really succeed. Militant groups would, with time, grow bolder and bolder, and from this, their attacks would become stronger, including on police and security personnel over the course of 2016 and 2017. I feel like a broken record when I say, and things got worse, as that seems to be a running theme with many of the videos that I end up making. But as all of this is happening, the economy was not getting any better. In fact, things were going to get significantly worse. Growing economic problems would lead to the government being forced to slash public subsidies of electricity and water, as well as raise fuel prices and also hike up public transportation fares. This, as you can imagine, would put a lot of pressure on the lower classes of Egypt. Why would they do it then? Well, because they kind of had to. In order to secure a $12 billion bailout loan, Egypt was required to slash subsidies that the state simply could not afford. In addition, they would also go on to add a value-added tax and also float the country's currency after having propped it up for literally decades. This goes back to the thing that I was talking about before with why Egypt had been propping up its currency in the first place. Yes, it made it easier for the average citizen to buy goods as their currency was stronger, but simultaneously it meant that Egyptian exports were weaker, and so in order to boost market competitiveness, they allowed their currency to decrease in value. With this weaker currency that theoretically should get stronger over time after that, that would hopefully encourage foreign investors back into the country, and it would also end the currency black market where things were traded for more real values versus what the government said that they were worth. Of course, even if things get better on the macroeconomic level, it doesn't mean that things are easier for the average person. In fact, things get much worse, as I said. In the immediate aftermath, the price of a cylinder of cooking gas for commercial use would nearly double. The price for home consumption would increase by 40%, and in many cases, a liter of petrol would rise by 50%. In addition to these costs, metro fares would rise by around 250%, drinking water would increase by 45%, and electricity by 26%. When you consider the fact that nearly 30% of the 100-odd million Egyptians in the country at this time lived below the poverty line, that means that these cuts were going to hit people significantly harder. Interestingly enough, unlike what you had seen in previous political movements in earlier years, Egyptians did not this time go out into the streets to mass protests, largely because they couldn't. Many feared the harsh crackdown on all dissidents that had been adopted by the military since it had taken power in 2013. If you thought that the previous years were harsher, it got significantly worse. More than 100,000 Egyptians were in prison by 2018, with an estimated 60,000 of these being not everyday criminals from petty theft or anything like that, but rather political prisoners. Newspapers, television channels, human rights organizations, all of these were shut down. The problem became so bad, and people were so aware of these issues occurring within Egypt, that as a sign of peace, the government would go on and release 3,400-something prisoners on the first day of the Muslim celebration of Eid in order to show their benevolence. But I'm getting ahead of myself here at this point. The people are obviously upset. These reforms have taken place, and in many cases, they are necessary in order to be able to save the state. But what is the result? Well, technically speaking, they worked. The foreign currency issue was fixed, with reserves growing by about $15 billion from 2016 through 2017. But at the same time, many businesses throughout Egypt would suffer as inflation would soar during this time period, and high interest rates would make local productivity and loans difficult. If anything, the economy during this time period was not in freefall, no, but it was relatively stagnant. And yet, despite the issues, despite everything that I have talked about in here, in the year 2018, President Sisi was re-elected to power with a whopping 97% of the vote. 97. Yes. If you're wondering if voter turnout was very high during this time period, the answer was no. And if you're wondering if he had any competition, well, the answer is basically no. And yes, that is a spicy thing right there. Yes, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was re-elected for a second term after an election campaign in which 5 of his potential challengers were prevented from ever actually getting on the ballot in the first place. The only challenger that he had, if you want to even call it that in the first place, was a guy by the name of Musa Mustafa Musa, who had previously declared that he was, quote, not here to challenge the president, which is not a thing that an opponent usually says, and he had only entered the race at the last minute after the 5 other potential challengers were blocked from getting on the ballot in the first place. If this is sounding suspicious at all or like a setup, yeah, Musa would go on to concede his loss on television, saying to the TV station that he had hoped for 10% of the vote, but that, quote, I do know the immense popularity of President Sisi. So yeah, if that does not sound like a setup, I really don't know what does. In comparison to his hopeful 10%, the other challengers who could have gone against Sisi were significantly stronger, but most of these were sidelined, detained, or pulled out of the race before something could possibly happen to them. Opposition groups would during this time call for a boycott of the vote, which they would label as a facade, that it didn't actually mean anything, which, if you go and look at it, kind of does make sense. Over the course of the election, there were no presidential debates, and Sisi himself, the guy who was running for office, did not ever actually appear at any official campaign events. Like, not a single one. He just didn't bother showing up to a single thing that he was running at. In an interview that would occur literally just a few days before the vote, Sisi would go and say that he wished there were more candidates, and at the same time denied that he had any role in sidelining them. Because, you know, of course. Yeah, this individual that we're talking about here, this is the guy who, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is the one who is building a new capital in the middle of the desert. Which, on that note, by this point in this disastrous video, we should probably go and actually talk more about that and why that is even happening in the first place, since that is what inspired this video in the first place. It's tied into every single thing that we have listed here so far. So, the capital. First announced back in 2015, Egypt's new, and still to this day not yet named capital city, has been under construction for years, to an estimated cost of over $50 billion. Temporarily referred to as the new administrative capital, the massive development is just one of several mega projects that is being built by the government of President Sisi. The new city, which is around 28 miles southeast of Cairo, is planned for more than 6 million residents, and is designed in part to relieve the traffic and other issues of crumbling infrastructure that is faced in Cairo, which, to be fair, does actually make sense considering how absolutely congested and slum-filled Cairo is today. The project, which is largely operated by Egypt's Ministry of Defense, will go on to consolidate and move government headquarters into a more controlled and clean setting, something that is monitored by more than 6,000 surveillance cameras. As I already had previously mentioned, this new city is home to the tallest building in Africa. It is also home to a huge presidential palace, to dozens of ministry buildings, schools, hospitals, mosques, and churches, with many, 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 many more projects in this yet to come. Of course, completion remains years away, and the Egyptian government, in order to finance this, has gone very deeply into debt. For anyone who is wondering why exactly this is happening, autocratic regimes in search of legitimacy have long used mega projects in order to cement their authority and affirm control over their respective populations. Egypt, when we're talking about this, is really no different. The military regime of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has, since 2013, been busy building numerous different extravagant mega projects, things that we could talk about in other future videos, and many of these have ultimately ended up being follies. Things that didn't actually do what they said would do, or were pointless from the very get-go, such as an expansion of the Suez Canal that the investment into this was supposed to bring in massive amounts of revenue for the state, and it didn't. It failed to actually return the cost that had been put into it. In addition to this, other construction projects were designed to revitalize the construction sector across the country and create new jobs, but most of these were very low-skilled labor jobs and were in turn used to build new, lavish presidential palaces and other buildings that ultimately would not have the common people be able to rise up and get those jobs in the first place. Either way, when the project was officially announced back in March of 2015, it was revealed that the Egyptian military had already begun building a road that was going to go from Cairo to the site of the future capital. And as soon as the announcement was made, and to this very day, the issue of how this whole thing was supposed to be financed was something that had been the subject of many contradictory declarations. As an example, the president had repeated on many different occasions that the project was not going to cost the state anything. However, reports that would end up coming out would show the opposite, that most of the funding would come from state agencies, which in turn would cause them to go into debt with public banks and also the national treasury. As for who was going to get this money to build things in the first place, when the project was first announced, it was a Emirate businessman by the name of Muhammad Alabar who was given the task of raising the money by creating an investment fund, Capital City Partners. But Alabar, after only a few months, would end up withdrawing from the project. And after him, it was China that was solicited, until ultimately negotiations would end up collapsing again. In the end, no other multinational entity or corporation really saw much feasibility in the project. And so in order to pursue things, the Egyptian government would decide to handle the financing itself by creating a company for that specific purpose, the Administrative Capital for Union Development, or ACUD. 51% of this company would be held by two agencies placed under the supervision of the Defense Ministry, this being the Armed Forces Land Projects Agency, or AFLPA, and the National Service Projects Organization, or NSPO, and the remaining 49% by the New Urban Communities Authority, or NUCA, which depends upon the housing ministry. So yeah, it would go from literally, oh, this is not going to cost us anything within the government, to, yeah, the government has to do literally everything. And so while the government would go and finance the construction costs from the sale of land to private promoters, in fact, what would end up happening is that the money would pretty much go straight into the hands of the military, while the state would go deeper into debt, as it was military officials who were overseeing everything in the first place. Do you remember any of the previous videos where I've talked about things within China or South Africa and where corruption runs rampant with contracts? Yep, the same thing would pretty much be happening here. There would be a couple Egyptian construction giants that would share a great many of these contracts, including Orascom and Hassan Alam Holding. For these and other companies, contract awarding is typically determined by cronyism. There would be multiple reports that would come out that several companies, originally which had been small or medium-sized, would be chaired or owned by retired generals or members of security personnel, which in turn would experience meteoric rises in terms of their profits and would grow rapidly. This is the case of what would happen with Concord for Engineering and Contracting, Gamma Construction, or Samcrete. A large number of the companies that we're talking about here that were in the private sector, which would win contracts for the construction of the capital, these and many more companies, which were technically speaking in the private sector and not government owned, they would win contracts and, as previously stated, would be owned by retired generals, ex-army personnel, their families, etc. Anyone who, technically speaking, was independent, but still had a tie to the government. And they wouldn't be the only ones that this would work for. That same dynamic would appear among property developers. Of the approximately 400 developers that are active in the new administrative capital, many of these have long histories of connections with the regime, and their structures are questionable at best. Many of these housing developers, even if they are not part of the government directly, they are important backers of the regime. As an example, we have Hani Al-Assal, who is the head of Misr Italia Group, which was among the first and largest purchaser of land in the new administrative capital. Another example would be Abdel Hadi, who is director of the Plaza Gardens Development Company and a member of parliament, as well as secretary of the pro-Sisi party Hama al-Watan, which, can you guess it, is a party that was founded by a group of retired military and police officers. Because of course. This guy was a pretty big figure. One of the things that he would regularly do is that he would regularly appear in Egyptian television talk shows, and he would promote the mega projects that were being done by the state. You know, anything to kind of give a positive spin to the public. These projects, in turn, were being done by other ex-military officials, as one of these, as an example, is the Gates Development Company, which is headed by a police general. This was created specifically in 2018 in order to handle building projects in the new administrative capital. If you've noticed a common theme of everything that I've been listing in here so far, like you take a closer look at the people, at the guys who are in charge of all these varying different projects, and you really see, just based off titles alone, how deeply the country's security personnel are tied to to the companies and also to the profits that are gained in the construction of this capital, whether that be as direct owners of facilities, as shareholders, supervisors, suppliers, all of these different personnel that are tied to the army or security or other members of office are also getting their toes dipped and wet in the potential sea of profits to be obtained from this. And remember, these guys aren't bureaucrats. One of the big problems that is faced is that many of the former military officers that are appointed to be the heads of these government agencies and companies, they oftentimes will prove to be incompetent. The only reason that they get to the job in the first place is through bribery or just being loyal. They do not have the capabilities, in many cases, of being able to handle the missions that are entrusted to them. Combine this potential incompetence with massive amounts of public debt, as well as the Army's rent-grabbing practices, and this is honestly something that can lead to disaster, the collapse of the entire project even. As an example of one of these problems, one of the key issues that the Egyptian state is facing in this new capital is how many of the apartments that have been constructed or being constructed are completely unaffordable for the people that they need to move into it in the first place. Back in 2017, a government statistics agency had found that there were 13 million housing units that were either under construction or were completed and yet still vacant, like no one had actually moved into them. Considering the expense of these apartments, at the time there was only like 100 residents in the place, and even now there's only like 10,000 families. This means that the new administrative capital is largely a ghost town, as the majority of people cannot afford the houses in it, despite the fact that there is infinite places for them to move into. The cost, though, is only part of the problem. A second issue that is being faced is the methods that are used by developers belong to a category of fraudulent financial packaging known as Ponzi pyramids. For anyone that saw my Chinese construction video, the way that this essentially works is that the buyer of a property, of an apartment, of something, makes a down payment. The developers then use that to start the construction, but if they fail to find more investors to develop more projects, that means that they won't actually have the money to be able to finish the work or deliver the homes that were paid for by the original buyers. That leaves everyone, in the end, without money and without a place to live. And that money that I'm talking about here, that can very well run out at any time. Remember how over the course of this video, a large percentage of the story has taken place between 2015 and 2018? Do you remember what happens in 2019 that I always seem to have to bring up? The COVID-19 pandemic. Remember, my friends, that in 2016, Egypt had a very successful devaluation that would go and end decades of wasting billions of dollars to try and maintain the country's currency peg and stabilize the Egyptian pound. While many average everyday Egyptians suffered from the sudden and very steep loss of value for the Egyptian pound, it was a kind of bitter medicine that was needed in order to have a healthy and eventually stronger currency. The days when billions of dollars were getting wasted propping up the pound were behind Egypt, and seeing an attractive interest rate as well as a possible rising value of currency again, because if you've lost 75% of your value, theoretically, it can go up again in value. This means that investors were starting to look at Egypt again as being a place where they could put their money, especially hot money investors, entities that would in turn pour billions of dollars into Egypt. Now, my friends, I know that we are using a term here, again, that has not been used on this channel before, so I will have to explain something, but hot money investors, for those that are not aware, these are investors that are external or non-resident investors. They are people that try to buy short-term, high-yield debt instruments. To explain that further, an example of one of these things would be like someone going into a country, buying a local currency treasury bill that has a one-year interest rate of like 12, 13, 14, 15%. Something that is really high for an interest rate, but is going to give them very high returns on their money. In the case of Egypt, these kinds of treasury bills were issued back in 2021, which at the time had a 13.25% interest rate. For investors who are looking to make a quick buck, which in this case would be over the course of 1 year, that is something that is a pretty attractive offer. In addition to this very high interest rate, central bank's governor, Tariq Amer, would assure those investors that their Egyptian pound-dominated returns would be able to be converted back into dollars when they mature, which, for anyone, would earn substantial returns as long as the local currency remains stable, does not lose its value, or even better yet, appreciates in value. After the Egyptian pound had fallen as far as it did, if it increased in value by 10 or 15 or 20% over the course of a year, which admittedly that is pretty crazy, even a moderate gain of 2 or 3% value would still mean that the high interest combined with increased value means those investors are only going to be making more money. Seems like a win-win. And everything was actually looking pretty up for the first few years after this devaluation, until COVID hit in 2019 and 2020, and the pound would plummet. This, my friends, would be the beginning of the slow train wreck that is the Egyptian political and economic landscape. While no one is really able to verify if Amer was taking the decision as central bank governor, or if there were terms that were forced upon him politically by different political leaders, what we do know for a fact is that the central bank went back to propping up the Egyptian pound's value again artificially using its reserve dollars starting in June of 2020. You know, one of the very things that had led to them having a severe problem in the first place. At the same time that they do this, there is an unprecedented global economic crisis, the thing that was caused by COVID-19, and there really is no clear end in sight. Because at this point in time, all over the world, there are pretty much crises everywhere. Most international institutions don't really care about what the Central Bank of Egypt is doing at this time with its currency peg, because many different states were trying to do interesting economic maneuvers in order to make sure that their country didn't just collapse, with many believing that such a thing would only be a temporary or short-term emergency measure that after a little bit, a few weeks, maybe a few months, half a year at most, this could go away. It would stop. But no, the Central Bank of Egypt would keep propping up its currency for 20 months. Yes, my friends, the Central Bank of Egypt would go and prop up the Egyptian pound from June of 2020 all the way through March of 2022. This would be something that would repeat the exact same mistake that they had had prior to the 2016 devaluation. Over the course of this time, in order to maintain the facade that everything was fine, the Egyptian state would borrow billions of dollars in order to maintain the illusion that the currency was fine, it was stable, there was nothing wrong, because they need to keep the investor money flowing and coming in. This in turn would allow them to continuously show to these hot money investors that they had good investments, that their money was worth it. Thus, these investors would continue to buy up Egyptian debt, which means that not only was the Egyptian state taking out billions of loans to prop things up, but they were also continuously taking out more billions of loans from these investors. For anyone who is watching this video right now, here's what you have to understand about these investments. Given the fact that they are very high yield and short term, hot money financing is something that costs the state a lot. And the longer that it goes on, the more risky that it is. The risk in this case is that if anything goes wrong, there is a severe issue of capital flight at the first sign of economic trouble that could occur. The greater the percentage of those non-resident short-term investments that make up a country's local bond market, the more vulnerable that the country is to having its foreign currency reserves depleted in the case of capital flight. If everyone tries to go out and take their money out of the country in one go, considering that they have been promised that they can get dollars for them, well, you see the issue here. During the final quarter of 2021, non-resident investment in Egypt's local bond market stood at $28.8 billion, which was around 56% of the central bank's foreign currency reserves at the time. That's right, over half of all foreign currency that was tied up in Egypt at this time was in short-term, high-yield bonds. That made Egypt extremely vulnerable to capital flight, which in turn made it extremely vulnerable to defaulting on its debt. In other words, bankruptcy. By the end of 2021, because of the central bank's strategy, Egypt found itself with over $138 billion in external debt, with $22 billion of debt scheduled to be repaid over the course of 2022. Considering how little money the Egyptian state had during this time period, they would have to borrow even more money in order to be able to pay for the imports that they needed to keep their country afloat in the first place. What makes matters worse about all this is that since every single country in the world was experiencing some kind of currency fluctuation or issue in 2021, since the supply chain crisis would pretty much wreck the global economy. Any kind of financial analyst looking at this, any kind of political entity that was trying to see what was happening with their money, they would be able to notice that the Egyptian pound was not fluctuating, even though it should have. This was weird. Egypt did not have the most robust and healthy economy in the world. Anyone looking at this could see that something was not right. This, in turn, would cause some of Egypt's non-resident investors to get cold feet and would withdraw $5 billion of their hot money investments between September and December of 2021, leading to even less money within the state. And at the same time that this is happening, everyone is starting to get a little nervous about what is going on with Russia and Ukraine. Are you ready for it to get worse? Because my friends, it gets a lot worse. As 2022 begins, the prospect of a war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine seems more likely with every single passing day. Ultimately, for those watching this video now, you know that war eventually was going to come to pass. And given that these two countries were the main sources of Egypt's wheat supply, as well as its two top sources of tourism dollars, the central bank started getting really nervous. If a conflict would break out between them, that would have severe ramifications for Egypt's economy. Sensing that with both internal financial issues as well as this looming external economic crisis that was about to break out, many investors in Egypt got cold feet and they withdrew their money, triggering a capital flight of some $25 billion from Egypt in February of 22, right as the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out. And so facing dwindling dollar prospects, central bank governor Amer would decide to solve this crisis in what is possibly one of the dumbest and worst way possible, by punishing the Egyptian private sector. Remember when I said that Egypt was dependent upon imports for pretty much every single aspect of their country? Well, the Egyptian private sector needed to pay the varying different suppliers around the world in dollars. And so for every time that they completed some kind of transaction, this meant that that transaction was taking those precious, much-needed dollars out of Egypt's banks. For Amer, losing those dollars was not acceptable. They could not let that happen, which meant that the central bank and him went and created further restrictions on local importers' ability to actually get those goods that they needed. The decision to do this would cause massive amounts of anger as well as panic the Egyptian private sector, with many importers becoming suspicious that the reason that the central bank was doing this was because they simply didn't have enough foreign currency to actually make these transactions happen in the first place. Their suspicions were confirmed on March 21st, when the central bank would remove its currency peg, which would send the Egyptian pound plummeting from 15.6 Egyptian pounds to the dollar to 18.5 Egyptian pounds to the dollar in the span of merely a few days. But hey, guess what? It only gets worse. The panic of importers would only grow, since after the devaluation, this did not lead to more dollar availability like what you had seen back in 2016. And so analysts that were looking in on the situation started to wonder, was the government still pegging the exchange rate of the pound? Which, if they were, that is something that would end up costing Egypt billions of dollars that it could not afford to waste, all while denying their private sector and population of the dollars that they needed in order to buy any imported goods. That same week in March, Egypt would submit an official request for another $15 billion IMF loan, which, mind you, would be its third in 7 years, and would announce around $22 billion that they were getting from Gulf countries. But unlike last time, these were not going to be favorable or easy loans for relief. They were going to come with a lot of strings. And still feeling the pressure, the central bank would even squeeze the business sector more by announcing on April 21st that banks were banned from opening further credit lines for importers whose submitted foreign currency was obtained from, quote, unknown sources or exchange offices. It was only around 2 months later that the ramifications of those decisions would hit and the apocalypse would break out in Egypt. By June, it would break out that the Egyptian agricultural sector was unable to import crop seeds that it would need for months, something that would gravely threaten the entire sector, given that 98% of the seeds that it would use were imported. Yes, for those who are confused, Egypt, what was once the breadbasket of the entire world, has to import the majority of its seeds. So food prices are naturally going to skyrocket. The real estate sector started facing massive losses as building material costs would skyrocket due Due to the currency's uncertainty, they couldn't import any of the things that they needed to actually build things, meaning the leftover materials that were still there got way more expensive. The poultry industry was unable to secure the release of over 2 million tons of chicken feed that had already arrived in Egyptian customs for months. This would lead to the entire collapse of the industry, and millions of chicklets were killed by producers because they simply couldn't feed them. As this is happening, Egypt's credit rating crashes. As the summer would continue, the consequences of these imports freezes would start affecting every single sector in the country, from the most basic things that you can imagine to the most vital. Cell phone prices would skyrocket due to shortages, and this would cause traders to just stop selling what it is that they had on hand. There was no reason for them to do so. No one could actually afford them. Any kind of fashion or clothing stores, whether it was luxury or the most basic, they had no new clothes. Nothing could actually be imported. If you went to a supermarket, not only were you not able to get food for your family, but any kind of pet food that was needed to feed your animals was gone. All of that was imported. They couldn't get anything. For anyone who lives in the United States or another place that has issues with used car prices, car dealerships at this time for any car, whether it was new or old or anything, would severely overprice whatever remained, with some of these dealerships going and demanding more money past what they had initially agreed to, or they would just sell the car to another customer who is willing to pay more. Because they could, there was no other option. Prices of food commodities kept on increasing, and locally produced rice basically disappeared from the market. At least the local one. There were many rumors that existed at this time that rice that was grown in Egypt was being sent to sell on the international market just in an effort to try and secure more dollars, even if it meant that there was going to be a food shortage at home. In addition to that, pharmacists would also suffer from medicine shortages, as again, most of this was imported, and some were even caught selling fake medicines just in an effort to try and get by. Dentists had no real way to provide anesthetics for their patients that were having procedures done on them, and anyone who had cancer or some other kind of illness that needed to be treated at a hospital had to get their treatments done fast, or else there wasn't going to be anything for them at the end of the month. And so, okay, at the same time that this is happening, the public is panicking, everyone is suffering, things are going to chaos. The Egyptian state has been acting as though there is no crisis. Nothing is wrong, everything is fine. In order to prove this, the president even went out and bought a $500 million plane for himself, and the government would continue to sign multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project contracts to foreign companies. This including an $8.7 billion agreement to build internal railway systems for the new administration capital. In fact, what is insane is that the only person kind of affiliated with the government who's addressing the issue in crisis is Tariq Amer, the person who is the head of the central bank. Except he doesn't do this in a good way. On August 6th, he ends up publishing a letter in the state-run Al-Aram newspaper that just blasts the government's policy of not restricting importing for the private sector, which that is the thing that he goes and blames for the current crisis and draining Egypt's foreign currency reserves. Not, the spending of billions of dollars to prop up their own currency. No, that wasn't their fault. 2 days later, he would go and resign from his post as governor. And so can you guess what happens next? If you guessed it got worse, man, you've been paying attention to this video. As the bad news started to pile on more and more and the IMF loan stalled, Sisi would finally announce the need for a, quote, national economic dialogue, something that would be able to come up with recommendations to get Egypt out of its current crisis, and he vowed that he would follow its recommendations. A few days later after this, the government would go and announce that it was organizing the Egyptian Economic Conference as the forum for this dialogue, something that was going to be held in October of that year. But unlike what people expected, which was an announcement of some kind of expected reform or something else, instead, after this event, Sisi would announce his personal lines that he was not going to cross. As in, he was going to continue to rule. That was not something that was ever going to be a question. He was not going to step down. No one was going to be allowed to question his vision. And also, the government was not going to stop its spending on current and future national projects, no matter what the cost. Yeah, it's fine. Oh yeah, and in addition to that, the military was still going to be involved in the economy, because of course, and it's the private sector's fault, nothing else. The day after Sisi gave this speech, the IMF would end up approving a $3 billion loan to Egypt, something that was drastically smaller than the $15 billion that Egypt had originally asked for and really did need. The reduced amount would most certainly showcase that no one really trusted in Sisi's economic stewardship of Egypt, that he wasn't going to be capable of getting the country out of the crisis. But they still needed to give them something in order to stop Egypt from just outright collapsing. At the same time that this would happen, Egypt would undergo yet another devaluation that would send the Egyptian pound into a state of freefall, which would rapidly drop its value down to a rate of 24.6 to the dollar. And guess what? It only got worse. After holding up better than many experts had expected during the COVID-19 pandemic, Egypt's economy would begin to suffer severely as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. With them being so dependent on imports from these two countries, it's no wonder that food prices during this time would skyrocket. How bad are we talking here? Well, keep this in mind that the Russo-Ukrainian war is still ongoing to this day. And so moving into the year of 2024, there would be further devaluations that would end up lowering the value of the Egyptian pound down to 65 to the dollar, meaning not only did everything get very expensive for the average everyday person, but on top of that, the banks basically had no dollars to actually buy any kind of goods. Dollars were unavailable in any of the banks. This in turn would further disrupt supply chains, which would lead to more price hikes for varying goods, including food items like meat, sugar, oil, rice, and legumes. In March of this year, just 3 months ago at the time that I'm making this video, meat prices would jump by 30% over the course of 2 weeks, which would add to a 70% increase that had already happened over the previous 6 months. If you're an average person and you were just trying to get a bag of sugar, what this would mean is that you would have to stand in an extremely long queue at a government-subsidized outlet, with families restricted to just 2 bags each. Buying sugar at a general store without subsidies was simply something that wasn't feasible. It just wasn't available anymore. This exact same pattern would be seen with things like bread, with eggs, with dairy products. Even traditional affordable things like legumes, these would see their prices double. And what I have just listed are those specific items. Many more things have been affected. According to data from Egypt's Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, the price of food, just the general category of food, rose by 47.9% in January of 2024 alone. That is just January. And as all of this happens, meanwhile, President Sisi was miraculously reelected. Yeah, I know that I haven't mentioned elections here in a little bit because we've been talking about food prices and everything else for the crisis, but back in December of 2023, there was a very little contested presidential election in which Sisi would end up winning 89.6% of the votes. What this all means is that Sisi is set to be in charge of the country until 2030 at this point. But the question that anyone watching this video probably has at this point is, what is happening now? What is going to happen? Considering the destruction that has been wrought by the Israel-Hamas war and the amount of refugees that have poured into Egypt, the financial situation is not good. There has actually been a bit of an economic turnaround. And not suddenly because the economy of Egypt became great or anything like that overnight, no. Rather, now they actually have the funds, at least in the past couple weeks, to be able to do something, to sustain their imports, to actually get products into the country. An injection of funds spearheaded by around a $35 billion investment pledged by the United Arab Emirates, and also additional support that has come from the International Monetary Fund, European Union, and World Bank has meant that the Egyptian state, at least for now, is not going to collapse. They have the money to be able to do things again. Still to be seen, however, is whether or not the government is going to remain committed to the reforms that is tied to some of this help, such as enacting spending cuts and curbing the large role in the economy that is played by the state, including the military. The problem is, as we've already demonstrated multiple times in this video, is that with how ingrained the military is in the government, in spending, the new capital, in every single aspect of the Egyptian state, the loss of the military support would likely spell the end for Sisi and the current Egyptian regime. But, as it is, that remains to be seen, and while the government does have its investment, it does have its money, that will eventually run out. And then who knows what will happen. But my friends, that is likely to be a story for another time that we can do a follow-up on. For those who have been watching, thank you very much. I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like for us to cover next. I will see you all next time, and goodbye, my friends.